The psychology of the thief. Who robs grandmothers is highly specific and terrifying. An 81-year-old woman. She spent 40 years working in a textile factory. She cared for her children, her grandchildren, and then her sick husband until the very end. She saved as much as she could throughout her entire life. And on a Tuesday afternoon, someone presenting himself as a gas company inspector, smiling, using kind words, and acting with perfect patience, left that house with the money from the kitchen drawer, the gold rings from her jewelry box, and the peace of mind that had taken her 80 years to build. That man did not push her. He did not threaten her. He looked her in the eyes, called her ma'am with a warm tone, and robbed her of everything while she offered him a glass of water. Who is that man? What does he think? What does he feel? Or what does he not feel? How is the mind of someone who deliberately targets a grandmother structured? Today we are going to answer those questions with the depth they deserve. The first thing you have to understand is that the criminal who robs elderly people does not operate with the same psychological profile as the armed robber or the one who breaks in through a broken window. They are different profiles with different logics. The grandmother thief operates predominantly in the realm of social interaction, and that requires a specific set of psychological capacities. It requires the ability to produce interpersonal warmth in a sustained manner, without that warmth being genuine. It requires the ability to maintain composure and a narrative under the pressure of a face-to-face interaction with the victim. It requires what in clinical psychology is called cognitive empathy without effective empathy. The ability to understand how another person thinks and feels, not to connect with them, but to manipulate them with greater precision. This dissociation between cognitive empathy and effective empathy is a core feature of the psychopathic profile. And it is precisely what makes these criminals so effective and so difficult to detect. They seem human because they understand perfectly how humanity works. They simply do not feel it. The second fundamental element is the predatory selection of the victim. The criminal who specializes in elderly people does not commit his crimes at random. He operates based on specific criteria. The selection criteria include signs of social isolation, a person who lives alone, who does not have frequent visitors, whose home shows no signs of regular activity by others. They include signs of cognitive vulnerability, a person who responds with disproportionate warmth to the slightest gesture of attention from a stranger, which signals severe relational deprivation. They include signs of accumulation of value, a house containing accumulated valuables inside, jewelry and cash kept in the predictable places that the elderly typically use. And the criminal learns to read all these signs because he has read them before. Each crime he commits refines his reading ability for the next. If this analysis is giving you real tools to understand how those who exploit the most vulnerable think, subscribe to the channel right now. We publish high-level criminal psychology every week. Hit the like button so this video reaches more families who need this information. The third element is affective social engineering, and it is the core technique this criminal uses to gain access to the victim and their assets. Brute force is not this profile's first tool. The first tool is something much more sophisticated: the expert simulation of genuine human connection. The criminal knows that elderly people living in isolation have a level of relational hunger that substantially impairs their critical judgment during social evaluation. When someone who has gone weeks without having a real conversation with another person receives attention and warmth from a stranger, the brain activates its social reward circuits in a way that can partially inhibit critical evaluation circuits. It is not naivety. It is neurobiology. That is why the grandmother thief always takes his time, always with a story, always with questions about the victim's life. He asks about the children. He comments on the framed photos on the wall. He remembers on the second visit the details the person told him the first time. Every detail remembered is an investment. Every moment of simulated connection is a crack in the victim's defense. The fourth aspect is the exploitation of domestic geography. There is a deep psychological difference between being robbed on the street and being robbed inside your own home. Inside the home, The victim is psychologically relaxed, less alert, more willing to believe in the good intentions of the visitor. They are surrounded by all their possessions, which means the criminal is immediately close to everything he needs. And they are far from the public eye, which means the criminal can operate with much less risk of being seen by third parties. Access to the interior of the home is the central objective of the criminal's strategy, and he pursues it with the patience of someone who knows that the time invested in building trust is directly proportional to the freedom he will have to act once he crosses that threshold. Leave a comment now. Have you had to protect an elderly family member from a situation you now recognize as this pattern? How did you identify it? What did you do? Your story in the comments might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to protect someone they love. The fifth element is the internal psychological profile of the criminal, which is not monolithic. Criminological researchers have identified at least 3 distinct subtypes within this category. The first is the purely opportunistic offender. He detects a vulnerability in a given context and acts with a relatively low level of planning. He usually has a history of varied prior offenses and lower capacity for sustained manipulation. The second subtype is the methodical predator. He has a method developed through experience, selects his victims with consistent criteria, and operates repeatedly and systematically. He is the most dangerous subtype in terms of cumulative impact because he is rarely arrested after the first offense and because each crime he commits makes him more efficient in the next. The third subtype, the most disturbing of the 3, is the trusted acquaintance, the neighbor, the hired caregiver, the distant relative, the church member who has privileged and sustained access to the home and the victim's trust, and uses it methodically to steal assets over time in small amounts that are imperceptible in the short term but devastating in the long run. The sixth aspect is the cycle of impunity and how it progressively feeds on itself. The first time a criminal robs an elderly person without significant consequences, a neurological reinforcement occurs in their brain, reinforcing the association between that type of crime and the lack of consequences. The inhibition threshold decreases. The second time is neurologically easier. The third time, even easier. The factor that perpetuates this cycle is the silence of the victims, who in an alarming proportion do not report it. The reason is the same that makes the elderly vulnerable in the first place. The fear of judgment from others. The fear that if they tell what happened, their children will decide they are no longer capable of living alone. This deep shame and this terror of the consequences of admitting vulnerability are exactly the conditions the criminal counts on. He does not just steal the money. He steals the very possibility of the narrative. Share this video right now with your family. Not tomorrow, now. Talk to your grandmothers, to your elderly parents, to any elderly person in your circle who lives alone. The information you have just received is active protection. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming analyses. What you should take away from this analysis is this. The thief who robs grandmothers is not a hard-to-imagine being or a movie character you would instantly recognize. He could easily be the friendly young man from the apartment downstairs, the technician who came to check the electricity meter, the parish volunteer, the nephew who calls more often than usual. What defines him is not his appearance or his vocabulary. What defines him is a very specific internal psychology, the ability to emotionally erase his victim from his moral landscape, to use warmth as an extraction tool, and to construct internal narratives for himself that allow him to go on living with what he does without his self-concept collapsing. That psychology is not invisible. It has signs, it has patterns, and now you know them. There is a final dimension to this analysis that has direct implications for public policy and social protection systems. The need to treat the vulnerability of the elderly as a collective responsibility and not as a personal problem that each family must solve on its own. Social protection systems that identify elderly people in situations of severe isolation early, that create community networks of regular contact, and that establish accessible, stigma-free reporting mechanisms do not only improve the quality of life of older adults, they directly reduce the rate of predatory crime against this demographic group because they eliminate the environmental and relational conditions that make that person an attractive target. Crime prevention against the elderly is ultimately as much a matter of social policy as it is of public safety. And societies that treat both dimensions in an integrated way are the ones that produce real results. There is a final observation that completes this analysis and has direct implications for anyone who has elderly people in their life. The best protection you can give to an elderly person you love is not technological. It is not an alarm or a camera. It is presence. It is regular, genuine, and non-patronizing contact. It is the ability to have open conversations about how these criminals operate, without making the elderly person feel that their vulnerability is a defect or a shame. It is establishing simple family protocols. No one transfers money over the phone without prior verification. No one lets strangers into the house without letting someone know. Any situation that feels off deserves to be shared without fear of being judged. These measures do not require technology. They require trust. And trust is built in exactly the same way the criminal destroys it. With presence, with listening, with consistency, and with time. The predator operates in the vacuum of human connection. Fill it, and the vacuum disappears. Sharing this video with your family is a concrete act of protection, not with the intent of generating fear, but with the intent of generating preparedness and awareness. An elderly person who knows these mechanisms is infinitely less vulnerable than one who does not. Knowledge transforms vulnerability into vigilance, and vigilance, unlike fear, allows for action. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each analysis we publish is designed to give you exactly this kind of tool.